You're listening to Civic from the San Francisco Public Press. There's a secondary problem piling up for tenants who've been struggling to pay their landlords during the pandemic. Some of them have taken on other debt in order to pay their rent.
I did recently help someone that was in debt $100,000 paying their rent. And they did that. They put it on credit cards. They borrowed money, depleted savings accounts because they were so afraid of being homeless.
One after another, these housing counselors told me, well, my client had no idea that there was a rent assistance program.
I'm Laura Wennis, and this is Civic. Remember the beginning of the pandemic when we thought that lockdowns and economic hardship, to say nothing of the spread of the virus itself, would last maybe a few months? Things were already looking grim for tenants, even then.
We're in a situation where any cut to income makes it really hard to pay not only rent, but really basic necessities. But we also see folks who are working some making horrible health choices because they are so scared about not making rent. They would rather, even if they have health problems, go to work in a situation where they're in danger than definitely lose their apartment or get evicted in a few months when this is over.
That's Sarah Sherburne Zimmer, Executive Director of the Housing Rights Committee of San Francisco. I talked to her and Katrina Logan, who at the time directed the Economic Advancement Program at Community Legal Services of East Palo Alto. She's now Interim Director of Programs. And that conversation happened last May. Even back then, they were already sounding the alarm. Debt was going to be a huge problem. Here's Katrina Logan.
A lot of debt might get sold to third-party debt collectors. And, here in California, the debt collection industry is rife for abuse and rife for, frauds and scams. Most of our tenants who, maybe worked out a pay and stay or maybe worked out a deal, they weren't unable to pay and then they leave. A lot of times they get letters from these debt collectors. They have no idea who they are, but they're claiming that they owe, thousands more than what they thought that they originally owed to their landlord. And they have no idea who it is.
At the time, we were talking about rent debt that was stacking up for tenants. Since that conversation, it actually looks like state law put in place protections against rent debt being sold to collections agencies. But it's not clear that the kind of debt we're talking about today, debt tenants take on in order to not owe rent any longer, has the same kind of protections. Let's use a hypothetical here. Let's say I'm a renter who's lost her job 3 months into the pandemic, so June or so 2020. I've heard that there's an eviction moratorium in place, but I don't know exactly how long it's going to last. People around me are moving out in droves, but I don't have savings anymore, so I can't pay a deposit and the cost of moving. At some point, I might say, okay, I'm going to have to borrow some money. At least I'll still have a roof over my head.
We've spoken to so many tenants who they've taken payday loans, they've taken loans from families, they've maxed out credit cards, they've foregone necessary expenses, they've used all of their stimulus and unemployment checks, et cetera, all of the above to be able to cover their rent. And there are no programs right now in place that would cover that sort of shadow debt is what we're calling it.
That's Shanti Singh, Communications and Legislative Director at the statewide tenants organization Tenants Together. You might remember her from our eviction moratorium episode a few weeks back.
They are part of that bigger pool of people who are going to be vulnerable to displacement or have been displaced already over that debt or are going to have that debt impact their lives in other ways for years to come.
Shanti's not alone in noticing this. Laura Hernandez works at the Eviction Defense Collaborative as interim director of their rent assistance disbursement program. She's seen this too.
I've heard folks, getting a lot of help from family. And then I've also helped people who did that, who gave their family members money. And so they're now in housing instability. And then,
no.
it goes both ways. Right. And then the, payday loans and also credit cards. I don't have a huge credit limit, but I guess there's people that have $50,000 worth of credit. And so they're just, they're just putting it all on credit cards. And other things just kind of cutting back on, they're not paying other bills to pay their rent bill, cutting down on their expenses. selling things.
Some bills can get deprioritized. Like if you've heard, for example, that PG&E isn't going to shut off your power if you don't pay, that might end up being one of the bills you choose not to pay over another. But there are other difficult workarounds that Laura's clients have had to figure out.
But I've seen people like remove pets from their rent, give up their parking space. And then I think like mostly, I think of like kids, like, not as much things being spent on their enjoyment, I guess. And then probably food. Folks are probably not buying everything, that they would normally need. Maybe they're getting like more from the food bank, The amount of debt I've seen definitely varies depending on, obviously the person. Everybody's different, but I did recently help someone that was in debt $100,000 paying their rent. And they did that. They put it on credit cards. They borrowed money, depleted like savings accounts because they were so afraid of being homeless, because they truly think that that's the only reason why that, they're able to live, is that they're not homeless. And also because they're like terrified of their landlord finding out that there's any sort of financial difficulties, because she just doesn't want them to treat them differently,
Wow. For most folks, is it in the thousands, tens of thousands?
I'd say tens of thousands, like more like 10, maybe. That would be like kind of the average or less, because depending on the rent amount and depending on how much folks can get, So I think that that's probably more around the average.
What's the potential fallout of this? Like, is this going to end up in small claims court or in collections agencies' hands? What are the potential consequences for folks who now have this debt?
Yeah, definitely small claims court for unpaid rent, collections, unpaid utilities, resulting in more fees. The money is going to cost them maybe double, triple, or something.
What?
There's maybe not rent, but once it gets to, if you're putting stuff on credit cards and you have a 15% interest rate, or these payday loans that have really high interest rates, you borrow $1,000 and it turns into $5,000.
Seriously?
Wow. It'll just, deplete even more, like their ability to recover from this impact, their financial impact.
When things do go to collections, what are the likely experiences of folks who have this amount of debt and who are being pursued for it?
I'd say at the core, lots of stress. They're experiencing an insane amount of stress this entire pandemic, and this is what they're worried about. They're worried about the aftermath, and then once they're in it, it's going to be re-traumatizing for them, and it's just going to dig them even deeper, and it's going to be harder to recover from this. Folks aren't going to break even,
Yeah. Is that fallout likely to be different or of a different magnitude for people who are already marginalized in other ways, like whether that's their immigration status or maybe their income or anything like that?
Oh, yeah. If you're already in a marginalized community and there's a pandemic, it affects the marginalized more. You're going to have to deal with a lot more than others. You won't be able to pay it off as fast. You won't have access to assistance, to the information. You don't speak the language. You don't have confidence because you don't have papers. And you feel like if you go to small claims court, you're going to get deported. And so you don't engage in the process. And then you automatically lose the case and it becomes worse. It just kind of reminds me of like a poor tax, like just constantly, bombarded with more just because you didn't have enough at the time.
Is it actually true that you can get deported if you go to small claims court?
It is not true. I would just say that undocumented community sometimes have fear of going to court because they think that it's all kind of connected, like that it somehow, decreases their rights, which it obviously does, but not in these instances, right? It's not connected.
We'll get back to this conversation about debts that tenants are taking on in order to pay their rent in just a moment. You've been listening to Civic from the San Francisco Public Press. I wanted to tell you about a podcast called Our Opinions Are Correct. Every other week, this show dissects a topic related to science fiction, science, and everything in between. They've talked about things like how to write a good fight scene, the death of the universe, and imagining the next political uprising. Our Opinions Are Correct is hosted by two locals. Charlie Jane Anders is the award-winning author of several science fiction novels, including the recently released Victories Greater Than Death. And Annalee Newitz is an award-winning science journalist who writes for the New York Times and The Atlantic. Join the two of them as they expand minds and befriend cosmic monsters by finding Our Opinions Are Correct on your favorite podcasting platform. Taking on debt to pay rent has serious risks, but people have many reasons for doing it. They might live with the person that they owe rent to, which makes it a bit more stressful to not pay rent than owing money to a faceless, distant company. It might also just be unfathomable for some people to not pay rent and to stay. My colleague Noah Arroyo, assistant editor at the San Francisco Public Press, has been reporting on this issue of secondary debt for a while, and he's talked to some of the same people that you've already heard from, and more. I asked him about this. One of the people that both you and I spoke with, Laura Hernandez at the Eviction Defense Collaborative, told me about how undocumented people in particular were so concerned about potentially going to court over the debt that they owe to their landlord because they were afraid that it would lead to their deportation. That's not true, but it was a pervasive fear that understandably drove people to take out loans that are perhaps dangerous to their financial health. Are there other scenarios and reasons that you've come across in your reporting for why people would go into these arguably more dangerous kinds of debt?
Well, I think in the case of many members of the Chinese community, there's a sense of duty, a sense of responsibility, as we've talked about, not wanting to owe money to your landlord. And it's not just a sense of responsibility, it's also a sense of vulnerability. They'd rather owe that money to a friend whom they trust than to a landlord who might hold that debt over their heads and try to push them out, which I've heard about many instances with tenants and their landlords. Mm-hmm. Another reason that Shanti Singh of Tenants Together told me about is that this eviction moratorium that ended recently on October 1, it had actually been extended twice.
Right.
Yes. And both times, we didn't know that that was going to happen.
Right. Yes. As we talked about in the last episode on this topic, it's been extended before. Why can't it be extended this time?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And one of the big problems with the way all of that went down at the state capitol was that those discussions were happening behind closed doors, and they did not include tenant advocates. And so who's in touch with tenants? Is it the real estate lobbyists who were in those conversations, or is it the tenant advocates?
Yeah.
It's the ones who were shuttered out of it. So they didn't know what was going to go down or how it was going to work. So when they're in touch with their tenants they represent, then they don't know what to tell them.
So the tenants come to them and they're like, okay, I don't know if I should just pay up now because the eviction moratorium is going to end, or if I should wait because it's probably going to be extended.
Right, because the rule that has been consistent throughout the extensions is that when the moratorium ends, that if you don't want to be evicted, you have to have paid 25% of what was due since X date. Okay, well, what if you haven't done that yet?
Yeah.
Well, then, wait a second. Do I go into credit card debt to hit that 25%? Or do I just hope that it gets extended and I don't have to worry about it?
Right. How much am I willing to bet? Am I willing to bet the risk of getting evicted that this is going to get extended again?
Exactly.
Yikes. So that puts tenant advocates in the tricky position of telling their clients, like, yeah, I actually think that it's worth going into debt for this because you need to pay up that 25%.
Just roll that dice. I spoke with many people who serve clients who are people applying for rent assistance. And one after another, these housing counselors told me, well, my client had no idea that there was a rent assistance program at the time when they were going into debt to pay rent.
Yeah,
That's
how
why.
were they supposed to know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And this is actually something anybody who pays close attention to the local news will know that there have been story after story after story about the, for lack of a better term, the bad rollout of these rent assistance programs, which includes not promoting them well enough, that people just don't know that they exist.
Yeah. And what happens if you don't speak English very well? Is that a barrier to applying?
It was early on. We wrote a story, I want to say it came out in April, something like that, about how from the start, that these programs, they were tailored for people who spoke English, as well as people who spoke Spanish, but the other languages, not so much. If you spoke Mandarin, if you read Chinese, then you would go to these websites and you would not know what was going on. And it would discourage you from applying through what was at the time a much more complex application process. So you would have hours of confusion ahead of you. You would just stop.
What are some of the potential kinds of fallout that people who are looking at this are worried about?
I think just a continual accretion of debt nationwide, which is crippling for many households. Just that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, nervous laughter ensues.
No, but, all jesting aside, this is the thing. What I found in my reporting was that, and again, we don't have perfect numbers, but anecdotally, there are households that have taken on $5,000 to $10,000 of debt in order to pay rent during the pandemic.
There's one household that Laura Hernandez told me about that took on $100,000 of debt. I mean, what are you going to do with that?
Yeah. Well, and to underline the severity of this problem, that is an astounding amount of money. But even if we're just talking about the ballpark 5 to 10 that I've encountered, to put that in perspective, what's the average amount of rent assistance that's gone out to people through the state's program? So this is the amount of money that, as far as the state is concerned, is a meaningful amount of money to help somebody financially. It's about $11,000. So we're talking about somewhere in the ballpark of what the state is giving out on a household-by-household basis that is going to affect people's financial futures. So this is the same thing, but it just cannot be helped by these programs, at least not helped directly.
And again, there are some protections for rent debt that don't extend to other debt. State law now prohibits landlords from denying a prospective tenant housing based on the rent debt that they took on during the pandemic. But they can factor in secondary or shadow debt into a denial. So what can be done? I have to admit that so far, I have not heard of any program that specifically helps people with this kind of debt. Noah, in his reporting on this, talked with someone who's got a bird's eye view on this issue.
Well, Hannah Appel is an associate professor of anthropology at UCLA, and she's also one of the co-founders of the Debt Collective, which is a nationwide organization that pushes for debt forgiveness. The idea is that if you have a lot of people who all have the same kind of debt, then that's actually a form of leverage that they can have for organizing against their creditors to forgive the debt. And so they've made some strides in recent years in these efforts. And this is one of the places where, as far as she's concerned, organizers might want to be putting their attention, since you have so many people who have taken on this debt under similar circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Have there been any moves toward such a program?
No.
Same message from Shanti Singh with Tenants Together, although there are some pilot programs that might offer a starting point.
So right now, unfortunately, there aren't programs, and, direct economic stimulus can really help with this, right? But, we've already gone through a few waves of that, and so the question of political will is an issue to do that. But we have seen where a couple places, for example, there has been a pilot program in Marin County where Marin community organizations, actually some private funders, county officials, et cetera, and local agencies kind of came together and managed to use a pool of community block development, I believe, funding. Forget exactly what the pool of funding was, but they were able to use a separate pool of funding to address this debt, for example, for some undocumented residents in Marin, undocumented renters who are facing this debt and are also shut out of a lot of just easy access to any kind of programs. So that was an interesting example in the Bay Area of how shadow debt can be creatively addressed. But right now, there is no comprehensive program to really address that for renters at the federal level or at the state level. So a lot of the solutions here are going to have to be local. Mm-hmm. Although that's not to let the state off the hook.
Given that, I asked Laura Hernandez from the Eviction Defense Collaborative, what do you tell people who come to you and tell you that they've gone into this debt, that they've maxed out their credit cards or that they've gone to family members or gotten a payday loan?
We try our best to minimize the damage moving forward. So if, they come to us and they don't have any back rent, we're like, hey, what do you need help with? Looks like you've been paying your rent. And then they tell us, oh, well, I've been borrowing money. I've been putting it on credit cards. We tell them, okay, stop that. And, we're going to help you moving forward, or this is what we're going to do. Or even if for some reason there's nothing we can help them with, we still want to tell them, like, don't go into further debt. to pay your rent because there's a moratorium and you've already met the 25%. So we do try to counsel folks in the way we're letting them know, like, you don't have to, there's time. We can always deal with it later. Like, either way you're going into debt. Like, why don't we wait a little bit until the moratorium's over at least? We try to just minimize the damage. Mm-hmm.
Is this a question of like, who is it worse to be into debt to, your landlord or a payday lender or your credit card company? Or is it more about the terms of those debts?
I think for me, it would definitely be better to owe to your landlord because that's a debt that's not earning interest. So if you have a debt and you're not being charged interest on that debt, and there's rental assistance available. So there's no assistance available for paying back your uncle $10,000, but there is assistance available for paying back your landlord $10,000. So, we try to educate them and say, like, we can do this part. So you go ahead and buy your groceries or get your PG&E paid or pay your car payment so they don't come and take your car and you have to take the kids to school type things.
Here's where I have to reiterate and clarify a message from a previous show. Apply for the rent relief program. People who went into debt to cover their rent can't get that debt reimbursed by the state's rent relief program because the rent is paid. But the recommendation of advocates is still to apply because the rent relief program can actually cover your future rents. I'll let Noah explain this.
There is an indirect way that these programs can help people with what we're calling shadow debt, which is not a phrase that is consistently used, so caveat. But it is that people can apply for rent assistance for future months of rent. So let's say that you get that. You don't have to be unemployed to do that. Let's say you still have an income. So then for the next 3 months, you just put your income toward paying down your debt. That's something that you can do. But it's not the same thing as having the program directly pay for maybe the $10,000 debt that you've accumulated.
You still need to make less than 80% of your local area median income to qualify for the program. And of course, show that you were economically affected by the pandemic. And while the eviction moratorium expired last week, there isn't an official deadline to apply for rent relief. That said, it's better to apply sooner than later because we don't know how long money will be available. There's one other thing that came up in these conversations a few times, but with mixed perspectives, and that's bankruptcy. The first time I heard it mentioned was again in that discussion last May. Are there options for people who have that kind of debt? I mean, it sounds like the future holds debt for a lot of us. Is there anything that can be done?
As our president has shown us, you can just declare bankruptcy. Personal bankruptcy is an option for all Americans, although, again, you do have to be able to have some status here to file for bankruptcy. It's not free, it's not easy, it's not accessible. You don't get your own attorney. The process is not easy. You'll have to figure it out on your own.
This is something that Laura at the Eviction Defense Collaborative generally doesn't advise people on because in her capacity helping people access rent relief, she's not a financial advisor, and it's a very serious and personal financial choice to make.
It's very stigmatized. If I were in that position, I would definitely consider that. Might as well. But it's not something that we lead with just because people are already scared. And then we're like, don't worry, you can file for bankruptcy. Like, no, it doesn't really help people.
Lupe Areola, the executive director of Tenants Together, definitely doesn't advise it.
Going into bankruptcy means that your credit record is basically crap for the next 7 years. Mm-hmm. Especially if you're a tenant, that's going to greatly impact your ability to get future housing if you file bankruptcy because they're going to check your credit record. It could impact your ability to get a car loan, potentially even if you're applying for a job because now they check everything, including your credit record sometimes. So a bankruptcy is a serious thing. I mean, I know that maybe people like some ex-presidents will file a bankruptcy like it's no big deal, but it's actually a really big deal for most working class people.
Finding a real solution to this is going to take big picture thinking. That's what Sarah Sherburne Zimmer with the Housing Rights Committee was saying last year.
We have a full shutdown of the economy, and if we just make the economically best decision, we could have mass death. And we're having to weigh that, and that shouldn't be something that individuals have to do all the weighing themselves. The Bay Area has lower caseloads because we made decisions to shut down early. And we need to make sure that right now we're asking workers to hold all that burden themselves. We're asking tenants to hold that burden. And it's a burden we have to share across society, I think, in this moment. And that's why I think it is really important to talk about things like canceling rent right now, canceling mortgage payments, canceling some other kinds of debt, and that banks can absorb some of that. Landlords will absorb some of that, but it can't just be on workers themselves. That we can't just look at solutions that the only people who are made whole are landlords. That we really need to look at solutions that actually buy us some time to take care of each other. And some banks are doing better at this than others when it comes to mortgage holders. Some are willing to tack it on at the end. Some are also doing the mounting debt that you come up with in 3 months. Otherwise, you're in trouble. But we really need a bigger buffer. These are unusual times. We need to do special things.
For now, the bottom line for tenants in debt is to minimize the damage and apply to the rent relief program. But if you want to read more about what people like Hannah Appel with UCLA and the Debt Collective are saying about this, read Noah's story. Because he also had a conversation with a tenant whose identity we had to protect about how they ended up tens of thousands of dollars in debt. There's also more there on how big this problem really is, what we know and don't know, and a look at a study of who's most affected by secondary debt. You can find the story at sfpublicpress.org. I'm Laura Wennis, and you've been listening to Civic. Civic comes to you from KSFP LP at 102.5 FM in San Francisco. Our theme music is by John Dillon. Our team includes producer and contributor Mel Baker and assistant producer Liana Wilcox. KSFP is a project of the San Francisco Public Press, a nonprofit investigative newsroom. Find our reporting at sfpublicpress.org. Our staff here includes publisher Lila LaHood, executive director Michael Stoll, assistant editor Noah Arroyo, copy chief Kurt Aguilar, photojournalist and reporter Jessica Prado, and reporter Nuala Bashari. Civic airs Tuesdays and Thursdays at 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. on KSFP. New episodes every Thursday. Thanks for listening.